So the stumbling block of the cross would be the first element of impossible faith. Where do we go from there?
It would be the first and really the only one we need.
Significant one, yeah.
It would really be the only one we need. But I found a lot more that makes it even more difficult for Christianity to have been accepted. So let me go ahead and move to a second factor here, and I call this a geographical factor. Let me read a citation to you. John 1:46. Nathanael said to him, "Can there be any good thing come out of Nazareth?" Now you might not think much of that verse, but there's something very significant there. The society of the first century was very heavily into what we call today stereotypes. Now take the verse from Titus where it says Cretans are always lazy, gluttons, etc., etc. If Paul came out and said something like that today, what kind of reaction would he get from people out there?
Not politically correct.
Definitely not politically correct. He'd have to go through sensitivity training. He'd have to show up at the meetings of the Anti-Cretan Defamation League and make apologies. He'd have to do public service to Cretan charities and such in order to show that he was repentant over having said things like this about Cretans. The ironic thing is, though, you know who he's quoting?
Cretans.
He is quoting a Cretan poet who said that about his own people. The thing is that not only did they accept and believe in stereotypes about people who were from different nationalities, the nationalities themselves often reveled in being known that way. The Cretans were often quite happy to be said, yeah, we're lazy, and we're proud of it. The point being that when you came from a certain place or certain group of people, automatically certain associations would enter into your mind. Okay? And in that count, Jesus had 3 strikes against him. Let's talk about those 3 strikes. The first one is one we're all familiar with even today. Jesus was Jewish. Now, except among his own fellow Jews, of course, this is going to be a serious problem. How do you think the Jews were viewed by pagans of that time? Very much the same as some of these racist groups today view them. They were viewed as standoffish. They were viewed as people who wanted Rome to fail. You know, the Jews had been given a special exception by the Romans to not have to worship the Roman gods. They fought very hard to get that exception. Nevertheless, the average Roman looked down upon the Jews. You read some of the works by, for example, the Roman historian Tacitus. He reports all manner of horrible things about the origins of the Jews. It's stuff that sounds like it came out of some sort of Nazi tract.
Mm-hmm.
But they believed this kind of thing about them. Okay? So because Jesus was Jewish, anywhere outside of Palestine, the immediate reaction of anyone who hears about him as Savior is going to be, no way. There's no way someone Jewish is going to be the Savior. Second, Jesus was from Galilee. You say, what's the big deal about that? Well, let me say another word. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. What kind of reaction does that give you today? What kind of people do we think of as coming from those nations? Terrorists. Galilee was considered a hotbed of sedition, of rebellion by the Romans, and even by some of their fellow Jews. They were also considered very backwards, very uneducated, very uninterested in the Torah, in learning about the Jewish Bible. So to say that Jesus came from Galilee was one of the worst things you could have done. And it would have been so much easier to just say, well, he was from Judea, and who could have checked that out very easily? Oh, they could have at some point. But it would have been so much easier to say, well, he lived in Judea for this part of time or what have you. But instead, have him coming from Galilee. And that's one of the worst things you could do. The last one is reflected in that passage from John I just read, Nazareth. You say, well, what's the big deal about that? Don't we insult people even today who are from small towns? Say, that guy's from the wrong side of the tracks, right? There's a little town near where I live called Bithlo. It's like a town of trailer parks. It was constantly the butt of jokes for many years. Like that
Podunk.
guy. Yeah, Podunk. Yeah, Bithlo. He's from Bithlo, you know. Same kind of thing here. To be from a very small town was considered a very low honor. Now, in contrast, do you remember when Paul was arrested by the centurion at the temple, and he spoke of how he was from Tarsus and so on and so on? In doing that, he was establishing himself as a person of major reputation, because Tarsus was a much larger city of much greater reputation. The comment about Nazareth is the reverse of that. Nathanael is saying, Nazareth, nothing can good come out of a podunk town like that.
So a Jewish guy from a tin-horn town, geographically restricted, that doesn't have any wealth, doesn't have anything to commend him.
Yes. The wealth part was in there too, yes.
Oh my goodness.
All right, so are you getting the picture?
Yes.
You're getting the picture.
This is not the kind of thing people would want to run after and hook their caboose to.
Absolutely not. Not unless you had the validating evidence of the resurrection to back it up, which is once again God saying, in spite of what you think of this man and where he's from, I say he's from heaven. And that's the best validation you can get right there for geography.
And just for a moment, we can do an entire program on the resurrection. I know you're planning a book on the resurrection in the
Yes.
future. So at Tecton Apologetics, you're dealing with every kind of issue, JP. I mean, you're dealing with all of these issues, and they all touch one another at some point. But it seems the resurrection, Christianity as a historically presented faith, we are making a claim that no other religious positions are making. We are staking everything on one throw. It matters
That's
whether
correct.
or not he rose again on the third day. Not a spiritual resuscitation or a spiritual principle or a mythological image. We really believe that he rose from the dead.
And I'm glad you mentioned that in that frame as well, because there was a comment I made once that someone actually got an idea for a film for. There was a film titled Washington's Cross, and you can probably find a copy of it online somewhere. I had made this comment that believing in Jesus' resurrection as the historic basis for our faith is like someone saying, unless Washington crossed the Delaware, America can't exist as a nation. Now, if you had a situation like that, you can bet we'd have a lot of people here in America trying to prove that Washington crossed the Delaware. We probably have had some British people trying to prove that he didn't. And in this film, they depicted a society in which it was a crime to believe that Washington crossed the Delaware. And so you were persecuted, you were locked into a mental institution if you believed that. And this fellow kept saying, well, we have evidence, and he had a coin showing Washington crossing the Delaware. Similar situation here. Now, can you imagine someone standing up for a faith like this without sufficient evidence for the resurrection? Mm-hmm. No, not with all those contrary factors involved. And that's just two of them.
And what good would a dead Messiah be?
None whatsoever. Entirely useless. Just something to be ashamed of. I do believe, as I say, that Jesus probably would have had a small core of followers who would nevertheless continue to believe in him, though probably not as the resurrected Savior. They would continue to follow him perhaps as a great teacher.
And JP, what about the fact that in the post-resurrection appearances, his disciples weren't expecting this?
Okay.
They were shocked.
You know, that relates to the next point I want to do about the third factor that's a big problem. The resurrection itself is a huge problem with Christianity in that context, both for Jews and for Gentiles. Let's talk about that. Now, we need to reiterate exactly what resurrection is, because we talked about a bit that elsewhere. Resurrection has to do with a dead body physically being raised by God into a new glorified state. There's a one-to-one correspondence with the body when it is dead and when it is alive again. It's the same body, okay? It's not a new body. It's a remade body, reconstituted, okay? Now, this was a common Jewish belief at the time, but here's the catch. The Jewish belief was that resurrection would occur for all men at one time in the future, okay? The idea of one particular person being resurrected ahead of schedule, that didn't make any sense. They could have dealt with it if they had evidence for it, okay? And it made sense as something vindicating Jesus. But it would have been completely counter to everything that they had been taught about when resurrection would occur, okay? So that would have been a stumbling block for the Jews. The resurrection itself would have been a stumbling block. And you know, they could have made it easier if they just made this all up. Instead of teaching that Jesus had risen, and actually I believe this is what the disciples were anticipating would happen, and that's why they were confused when Jesus first appeared to them, they could have simply said that Jesus' body had ascended to heaven from the tomb, because that's what had been said to happen to Elijah. You know, he went to heaven in the fiery chariot, right? Or in the apocryphal stories of the time, that's what happened to Moses' body. It simply ascended to heaven. I believe the disciples were expecting and anticipating that Jesus' body would ascend to heaven. They were not expecting a resurrection, okay? And that's partly because there was no room in their belief system for the idea of a final resurrection.